Today, we'll continue our exploration of new attractions added for Disney World's 50th anniversary with Harmonious. Harmonious is the new nighttime spectacular on World Showcase Lagoon at Epcot, the replacement for Illuminations. Back in 2019, here on the podcast, we did a 3-part series focused on the making of Illuminations and why, in my opinion, it's the strongest outdoor spectacle ever produced by Disney. I watched Illuminations, which played for 2 decades, well over 100 times. If Disney looked back over my annual pass records and told me that I watched Illuminations 300 or 400 times, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Illuminations was an elegant show not interested in promoting Disney intellectual property, but instead offering a contemplation on the nature of humanity and its relation to the progress of Earth. These themes were fully expressed through music, fireworks, fountains, and video screens. The good news now is Harmonious is a true descendant of Illuminations. This month, as we continue to move through new offerings at Disney World, we'll discuss not only what is presented, but we'll focus on what the experiences are intended to communicate and also how you can best enjoy them. As with other new experiences, there are a few things that, if you know about them beforehand, should greatly increase how you enjoy them on your next trip to the parks. So with that, let's jump into Harmonious. Let me put this up front. Harmonious has received mixed reviews, but I'm much more positive on this show. I'd put a number of the less than enthusiastic reviews down to 3 elements. First, the stage orientation for Harmonious is very different than that of Illuminations. Illuminations was an experience in the round that was fully enjoyable at any spot around the lagoon. Harmonious has definite sightlines. The first night I watched Harmonious, I simply watched it to take it in and appreciate it. But the second night I watched it, I moved around the lagoon from back to front to better understand the optics of the show. There are specific viewing locations where the visuals in the show combine to present meaningful images, and there are also viewing locations where some of the images are simply interesting bits of abstraction and color. So some of these mixed reviews are understandable if viewers are not in the right location. Harmonious is a flat show, whereas Illuminations was dimensional. We'll talk about this more in a little bit. Second, I've seen this show in person multiple times now, and I've also seen it on video. Even good videos don't do the show justice. The show's structure is massive, and its scale is hard to appreciate on YouTube, but you can get a sense of its scale by focusing on the bottom of each of the barges. Each barge beneath the screen holds at least one full-sized door. I've watched technicians move in and out of these doors. These doors, painted black, are the same size door as on a typical suburban house. Above those doors, particularly on the Stargate hoop, are many feet of indoor space before the projection area, likely for technical equipment. In terms of scale, beneath each of those large screens is enough space for a low-roofed suburban house. So picture a low-roofed suburban house there, between the waterline and the screen, and then you'll understand the height of each barge. In person, the barges still look small, but only because they're at a distance from the shore. Out at Disneyland, a similar show, World of Color at DCA, feels large because the viewing areas are so close to the fountains. The height of the Harmonious show, I'm fairly sure, is larger than that of World of Color, but it feels smaller, particularly in online videos, because of the distance. Some of the mixed reviews, I'm pretty sure, are because people have only seen the show on video, likely on a small YouTube screen and with some tiny speakers, rather than the 100 speaker poles that surround World Showcase Lagoon. And lastly, Harmonious requires a lot from the audience, particularly on a first viewing, to assemble the message and to see how the various video segments speak to each other. The idea for the show started with a suggestion from Bob Chapek to create a concert-themed production focused on Disney films in World Showcase Lagoon. Steve Davison, who worked on a number of previous nighttime spectaculars, and Yaron Spiewak, who is a senior music producer and creative director for WDI, then added as much sophistication and depth to the project as possible using the original limitations presented by Chapek. That is, I think Davison and Spiewak deserve a lot of credit for expanding what might have been a simple jukebox presentation of Disney songs into a show that in its best moments has a thematic and visual richness that moves far beyond the original suggestion. And so, previewing a little of that thematic message and how it's arranged into the show, I think is helpful in finding a deeper connection to it, especially on your first viewing. So let's move through the show. It starts like this. At a half hour before showtime, those tall torches around the lagoon flicker on, bringing up, at least for me, pleasant memories of Illuminations. And then the building lights dim and the screens blaze on.
All around us, the world is alive with music. Voices calling out in search of one another, we find each other in song.
As with Illuminations, the show is arranged in 3 acts, 3 segments to explore a central message. The first is called Gather, which, as Davison points out, presents voices from around the world in a chant as a way of transitioning into the fluidity of music. On the center screen, against a dark background, appears a Maori symbol etched in light that conveys friendship and belonging. This image, after it transitions into a manta ray, swims up off the mist screen and, like images throughout the show, becomes a laser projection that hovers in outline above the giant mist gravity screen, which is better known in fan circles as the Stargate. In terms of music, the chants dissolve into 2 songs arranged into an overlapping medley. How Far I'll Go and Go the Distance. From a musical standpoint, the opening act is about a new dawn, new beginnings, and looking outward, gazing off at possibilities on the water and wondering how far this life will take you. It's about looking at the world beyond your own home and wondering how the journey ahead will change you. This is the invitation into Harmonious, a call to leave the familiar world behind and to lose yourself in the unfamiliar. The second act is called Celebrate. Again, to Davison and Spiewak's credit, they take what could be a simple premise and find visual depth in it. Over at the Magic Kingdom, these same segments would be presented in such a way the characters would be on model with their film images. But this show, again with Chapek's limitation of a Disney concert, wants to distance viewers from familiar visual and auditory experiences they already know about from film and present musical numbers as though their animation and music had been arranged in a way to more deeply connect with the artistic and musical traditions of the countries in which they take place. The underlying conceit here was to relinquish Disney films to artists in the countries they represent to create new versions that hold a deeper level of authenticity. As Davison put it, when talking with artists and musicians, they asked, quote, "How would you give Disney music and art back to us?" In this, there's a lot to unpack. Inside that notion is an interesting argument as to how the popular films have westernized stories associated with non-Western countries. In this, Davison and his team give back the stories to the cultures from which they originated and ask artists and musicians there to reinterpret the songs in such a way their presentation more deeply represents their home culture. The project essentially asks, how would these Disney features be different if they hadn't been produced in California or Florida or Paris? The visual answers presented in this show are interesting as artists and musicians feed new elements to deepen segments that, for many of us, are extremely familiar. I will also add this. Bob Chapek is invested in supporting the various brands of Disney. But the Harmonious show, though using Disney films as the springboard to celebrate world cultures, also partially undercuts the cultural legitimacy of the branded Disney films by pointing out that there might be a more authentic way to visually present these songs within their own cultures. Or think of it like this. The show designers of Harmonious today are asking this question. If we were to remake the films from previous years or even previous decades with an eye toward cultural accuracy, how would we do that? And I'm guessing that some Disney executives, if they understood that the show also held this message, might be less than happy with Harmonious as a nighttime spectacular. And that, I think, is a fascinating way to view this show. It's a dialogue focused on how animation and music can more meaningfully connect with international culture, even if the most authentic form of those songs is not the best-known version preserved in the Disney films. From another perspective, Harmonious also engages in interesting dialogue with Enchantment, the new nighttime show over at the Magic Kingdom, which offers many of these same characters and even the same songs, but with their screen-accurate on-model presentations. Again, I'm sending praise to Davison and Spiewak for getting this through committees without tripping off brand-centered alarm bells. In terms of what images mean, which cultural messages they carry, the visual discussion out on World Showcase Lagoon, at least in my opinion, is far more interesting and, even to use a brand-centered word, magical than the nighttime shows happening at the Magic Kingdom or Hollywood Studios right now. Nighttime shows at those other parks are about celebrating images of film as they are, without adding to those concepts in a sophisticated way. In terms of the show's progress, the second act, Celebrate, is the longest of the three. The thematic shift in Celebrate expands the material in the first act. The first act is focused on wondering what is beyond our own lives, our own neighborhoods. And the second act is focused on exploring what is out there, a presentation of world cultures as mediated by reimagined segments of Disney films. The films chosen are mostly from the last 2 decades, but they do stretch back to 1967 with a Hindi-accented version of one song from The Jungle Book. Many songs are presented in more than one language, which beyond English includes Mandarin, Zulu, and Spanish. In terms of looking at the lyrics to find connection points in the second act, many of these songs include descriptions of the environment where the story takes place. So this section becomes something like a musical travelogue, largely focused on the uniqueness of place. Arabian Nights describes the moons, dunes, and heat of an Arabian desert kingdom. Hakuna Matata, beyond the worry-free part, depicts life on the savannah. Out There from Hunchback explores life in Paris. And Touch the Sky from Brave revels in the misty mountains, dark woods, and deep waters of the Scottish Highlands. Again, not every song in this section has a strong focus on place, but the through line here is strong enough to suggest a definite motif purposely arranged into this act. To deepen the impact of the Musical World Tour, many of the characters, though not all in this section, are presented in silhouette so that guests can imagine themselves occupying the environments depicted on screen. As the second act moves towards its final song, the theme also changes towards a culminating message, from appreciation of world culture to a reflection of it. The transitional song is Dig a Little Deeper, which in its lyrics asks listeners to reflect on who they are, how they relate to the world, and what they truly need. In terms of a theme, the show has come full circle, from asking guests to look beyond themselves, to then asking them, once enlightened with cultural information, to then look inside. This song becomes the musical bridge that then leads into the third act, which is called Unite, and presents the concept that the world can find peace through understanding. Its centerpiece song is Someday from Hunchback, which explores how the world might work when we are wiser and more sympathetic with each other. The finale is a kaleidoscope of screen images beneath golden fireworks, iridescent smoke, and violet arcs of water. In a callback to Illuminations, the gravity screen on the Stargate hoop briefly transforms into a rotating globe, which was the signature icon for the previous show. And then, once the smoke and water settles, guests turn towards Spaceship Earth to find that it too has been transformed with light-projecting diodes that allow waves of color to pass over the sphere. During previews, when Spaceship Earth brightened with hundreds of colored lights, audience members around me let out a gasp, as though this geosphere was now a visual symbol for the type of transformation discussed in the show. In terms of viewing Harmonious, the most important thing you need to know, despite the various messages released to the marketing team, is this. The show is not designed to be viewed from the entirety of World Showcase Lagoon. The centerpiece for Illuminations was a dimensional globe which could be viewed well from many angles. Harmonious is arranged on flat screens. On my first night, I simply watched the show to absorb its message and effects. But on my second night, while watching the show, I walked around World Showcase Lagoon. It's a 20-minute show, and you can make the full loop to check sightlines and viewing angles. By far, the best place to view this show is from the front of the lagoon, just to the right of port of entry. This area is known as World Showcase Plaza. Ideally, you want to be able to look straight into the Stargate hoop. The 3 screens across the front often unify to create continuous images that can't be viewed well from other locations around the lagoon. At times, these screens form a guitar fretboard ornamented with rose petals, the landscape of the savanna with animals, and Pepita, the fire-brushed winged jaguar from Coco, flying low across the water. The main screen presents Pepita's head, and each of the side screens is a wing. If you can't see the interior of the hoop as though it were a movie screen along with the 2 side screens, you'll miss significant images in the show. The outdoor patios at the Rose and Crown in the UK Pavilion and at La Cantina de San Angel in the Mexico Pavilion offer reasonably good angles as well. The side areas of the lagoon, however, are not well situated for viewing all elements of the show. So some of those old standbys, which were really good for Illuminations, such as the balcony at Tokyo Dining, the second-floor windows at Maison Paul, or the open areas at the China Pavilion, will offer only limited viewing angles for Harmonious. Even the small island off of Italy, the one that Disney often rents for special events, doesn't have an ideal sightline for the show. For some of these areas, the show will still present interesting abstractions and effects, but the centerpiece images stretched across multiple screens will be missing or partially missing. Beyond World Showcase Plaza, the second best location is at the back of the park, just to the right of American Gardens Theater. That is, to the right of the theater if you're looking out at the lagoon. I should also point out that there are 2 downsides to Harmonious compared with Illuminations. The first is the obvious one. Those 5 barges are anchored in the lagoon and during the day disrupt the lovely sightlines that once connected Norway to France, Japan to Mexico. The bare metal of the structure seems more like something out of Tomorrowland than out of a place that is rendered as an appreciation of world architecture. The second has to do with layers of meaning. Illuminations was a visual essay with a theme that was presented with video images of world culture and natural environments. In this, Illuminations was brave. There was no Disney intellectual property in the show to promote Disney interests. Harmonious is a show filled with Disney IP. And in the use of the IP, there's also a secondary visual argument being put forward, a claim that the show wants viewers to accept. That claim is that though Disney, as a company, started as a studio with strong ties to European and American culture, decades ago, it became a studio interested in international culture. As with all formal arguments, the show offers evidence, in this case film clips and songs reimagined with musical and artistic styles centered outside of Europe and America. And again, like many formal arguments, it asks us as viewers, on the basis of this evidence, to change the way we think. In this case, to see Disney as something larger than an American company, more as a company with a long-time legitimate interest in stories that originate around the world. In this, there's an aspect that, in a small way, is self-serving in terms of changing the company's image. In this, too, the show also serves some corporate needs, but those needs, at least in my viewing of it, are secondary to the celebration of reimagined art and music that are truly the centerpieces of this production. So is Harmonious now the best production ever offered on World Showcase Lagoon? It's not. That is still Illuminations, and Illuminations set a very high bar. But is Harmonious the second best production produced on World Showcase Lagoon? It is. And it's also a show that, like Illuminations, might take more than one viewing to fully appreciate, as its messages are complex and woven with sophistication into the music and images. Throughout this month, we'll take a look at the new offerings just opened at the Florida Resort, a line of ambitious shows, a range of inventive restaurants, and even a new ride and themed area. And on Sunday, we're continuing our story of the grand opening of Walt Disney World, focused on the struggles and successes of the Disney team as they work to finish the resort in 1971. As you probably know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. If you enjoy these episodes, if you find this podcast a meaningful part of your week, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. I'll be back in a few days to continue our story of the grand opening of Walt Disney World. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.